They didn't even lower their voices. One moment, I was standing in front of the entire team, ready to present the forecast I had been building for weeks. The next, Mason, the brand new CFO, suit too crisp, voice too sharp, cut me off mid-sentence. Adrian, your time here is over, effective immediately. The room froze. Dozens of faces turned toward me, some wide-eyed, some quietly relieved it wasn't them. My laptop was still plugged into the projector, my slides glowing across the glass wall. And yet, in that instant, I was no longer part of the company I had given 18 years of my life to. I felt my throat tighten, but I refused to let them see me break. Mason smirked, as if humiliating me in front of my colleagues was part of the show. Every second dragged. People shifted in their chairs, waiting for me to explode, to cry, to protest. I didn't. I simply stood there collecting every detail, the way his hands trembled slightly, the way the CEO looked down, avoiding eye contact, the silence thick enough to suffocate. It's a strange thing realizing you've been erased in front of a crowd. You hear your heartbeat louder than the voices around you. You realize how quickly loyalty can be discarded when power changes hands. And in that silence, I made a choice. If they thought this was the end of my story, they were wrong. Before I tell you what happened next, where are you watching from? And let me ask you this, have you ever been treated like you were disposable at work? Leave a comment if this reminds you of something. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. I didn't shout, I didn't argue, I didn't give them the meltdown they were hoping for. Instead, I closed my laptop, slowly slid the cable out of the projector, and placed it back into my bag. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioner. My hands didn't shake, even though my chest felt heavy. Years of experience had taught me that silence could cut deeper than any words. I looked at the faces around the table. Some avoided my eyes, staring down at their notes. Others watched me like it was free entertainment, waiting for a scene. Mason, the CFO, leaned back with a smug grin. He thought he had won. He thought stripping me of my title in front of everyone would reduce me to ashes. But ashes can hide sparks. I gathered the few things that mattered from the desk I had called mine for almost 2 decades. My coffee mug, the one with "Think Twice" printed on it, now chipped on the handle, a small origami crane folded by a junior analyst on her first day. She said it was for good luck. And a framed photo of the team back when the company still felt like a family, before the suits upstairs turned it into a numbers game. As I walked through the open floor, people whispered. Some nodded quietly, like they wanted to say something but didn't dare. I didn't blame them. In places like this, speaking up could cost you everything. When the elevator doors closed behind me, I let out the breath I had been holding. The sting of humiliation was real, but underneath it was something sharper, resolve. They thought they had ended my chapter. What they didn't realize was that I was just turning the page. Because power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it watches. And sometimes it's the quietest person in the room who carries the sharpest weapon. And as I stepped out into the rain-soaked streets of Seattle that morning, I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. 18 years is a long time to give to one place. Almost half my life was woven into those walls, into that code, into systems no one cared to understand until they needed saving. When I first joined Argenta, the company was barely standing. Spreadsheets scattered like confetti, forecasts built on guesswork, and executives making decisions with blindfolds on. I was young, hungry, and maybe a little naive, but I knew numbers told stories if you listened carefully enough. So I built tools that could hear them. Line by line, script by script, I created the forecasting engine that kept Argenta alive. It wasn't glamorous. Most people never even knew it existed. But every product launch, every expansion into new markets, every boardroom victory, they all leaned on projections that came from my desk. The irony is that the more reliable I made it, the more invisible I became. I still remember the first time the system caught a pattern no one else could see. Hidden inside transaction logs was a trail that led straight to a fraudulent vendor siphoning millions. Executives called it luck. I called it vigilance, and I kept improving the model, teaching it to catch what humans missed. It was my quiet obsession, my fingerprint on the company's survival. Over the years, I automated reports, streamlined chaos, and locked it all behind safeguards, not to keep secrets, but to keep order. Still, whenever I asked about proper documentation or succession planning, the answer was always the same: we'll get to it later. Later never came. They wanted the results, not the responsibility. I gave them stability. I gave them growth. I gave them 18 years of nights, weekends, and every ounce of focus I had. And in return, they gave me a box to carry my things out in. But here's the part they overlooked. When you build something from the ground up, you understand it in ways no one else ever can. You don't just walk away and forget. And as I looked back on those 18 years, one thought kept echoing. If they think I'm replaceable, they're about to find out how wrong they are. Mason Hale had been at Argenta for less than 6 months, but you'd think he owned the skyline of Seattle the way he carried himself. Designer suits, polished shoes that clicked too loudly on the marble floors, and a voice that always seemed one octave higher when he was trying to impress the board. He was the kind of executive who loved appearances. Every Monday, he'd walk through the open floor with the coffee in one hand and a glossy deck in the other, full of charts he barely understood. To him, numbers were decorations, something to flash on a slide, not something to wrestle with until they made sense. I watched him once during a meeting when an analyst asked a real question about variance in revenue streams. Mason smiled, tapped the slide, and said, "We'll optimize that in Q3. It was a non-answer, but he delivered it with such fake confidence that half the room actually nodded. I wanted to laugh, or maybe cry. He wasn't stupid, he was ambitious. But ambition without humility is dangerous, especially when it sits in the CFO's chair. Mason believed anyone could do my job. He once told me in passing, "Adrian, your models are great, but honestly, this is just math. Plug in the numbers, hit run, and voila, right?" I remember staring at him for a second, trying to decide if he was joking. He wasn't. That's when I knew he didn't see the system as a living, breathing engine that required care and context. He saw it as a shiny calculator he could control with the press of a button. The board loved his energy, though. Young, bold, a fresh perspective. They saw him as the future of Argenta, and maybe that's why he thought tearing me down in public would solidify his place. If he could erase the old guard, he could shine brighter. But arrogance has a cost. Mason thought he was holding the steering wheel. He didn't realize he was already sitting in the passenger seat. And the engine he dismissed so casually, it was about to remind him who really built it. It didn't take long for the silence I left behind to turn into static. Less than 24 hours after my exit, the first warning message appeared in the system logs. Authentication timeout. Architect credentials required. Countdown initiated, 72 hours. To most people, it looked like another routine IT alert. But to me, it was the sound of gears locking into place. A safeguard I had built years ago, back when I realized that Argenta cared more about quarterly slides than the foundation holding them up. The rule was simple. If the system detected prolonged tampering or missing authorization, it would slowly shut down key forecasting modules. Not instantly, not dramatically, but one by one, like lights going out in a skyscraper. It gave the right person time to step in and fix it. Except this time, I wasn't there. Junior analysts noticed first. Their dashboards lagged. Charts froze mid-refresh. They filed tickets, flagged Mason him emails, but Mason waved it off. "Glitches," he said, sipping his overpriced latte. "Run the report again." He didn't understand that reports can't run without an engine, and the engine had already started its countdown. 48 hours in the logs grew louder. Lockout imminent. 47 hours remaining. Red alerts scrolled like a ticker at the bottom of the screen. Someone in IT brought it up during a prep meeting for the board. Mason barely glanced at the slide. He closed the ticket, told them to focus on the presentation, not the noise. That was Mason's problem. He thought problems could be ignored if you dressed them up with enough buzzwords. He never learned that silence in a system isn't quiet at all, it's pressure building. And as the hour slipped away, that pressure crept closer to the surface. Screens across departments froze. Emails bounced back with corrupted attachments. Numbers that once guided billion-dollar decisions flickered out, leaving empty grids. By the time Mason finally realized something was wrong, the countdown wasn't just ticking in the background, it was roaring through every corner of the company. And soon, it wouldn't be whispers in Slack channels anymore. It would be a disaster no PowerPoint could hide. At first, the problems were brushed off as minor glitches. A frozen chart here, a delayed export there. But inside Argenta, whispers started to spread. Slack channels lit up with quiet questions no one wanted to ask out loud. Has anyone else's dashboard stopped updating? Why does it still say Adrian's name on the model credits? By the third day, the glitches were impossible to ignore. Analysts preparing reports for clients watched their screens stall mid-refresh. Spreadsheets that once pulled live numbers now returned blank columns. Teams that had always relied on the forecasting engine suddenly felt like pilots flying blind through heavy fog. I wasn't there to see it in person, but I could picture it perfectly. The hurried footsteps across the floor, the muffled calls to IT, the growing tension every time someone tried to generate a report and got nothing back. And then came the meetings. People huddled around Mason's office, voices low, eyes darting to make sure no one important overheard. The system isn't responding. We're already behind on projections. The panic was quiet but infectious, like a ripple moving through the company. Everyone felt it, even if they didn't say it. Mason's response, dismissive, almost rehearsed. Legacy issues. Don't worry, we'll have it patched. He still believed a few slides could cover the cracks. He didn't see that the cracks were widening by the hour. And the employees, those who had once looked at him with cautious respect, now started to exchange uneasy glances. They remembered how quickly he had shoved me out the door, how confident he was when he said, anyone can do her job. Now that confidence looked less like leadership and more like arrogance. The irony wasn't lost on them. My absence had become visible in every blank cell, every frozen chart, every failed export. I was gone, but the system still carried my fingerprints, and no one else could read them. By the time Mason realized the whispers were growing louder than his reassurances, it was already too late. The panic wasn't just rumbling beneath the surface anymore. It was about to erupt in the one place he couldn't control, the boardroom. The boardroom was always polished to perfection. Glass walls, a table that stretched like a runway, and screens big enough to make even small numbers look impressive. Mason walked in that morning with his usual swagger, flanked by assistants carrying binders and glossy decks. He believed this was his moment to shine. Executives were already seated, waiting for the quarterly projections. These weren't optional updates. They were the lifeline of the company. Investors, strategies, entire product launches depended on them. Mason adjusted his tie, tapped the remote, and smiled as if he owned the room. The first slide appeared. A title page, crisp and corporate. Then he clicked to the live dashboard. Except the dashboard didn't appear. Instead, the screen turned black for a moment before filling with red letters, access denied, architect credentials required, lockout active. A stunned silence fell across the room. You could hear chairs creak as people leaned forward, blinking at the words. Mason froze, thumb still on the remote, pretending it was just a small delay. He clicked again. Same message. He tried another screen. Same result. One of the board members leaned back, voice sharp and cold. Mason, where are the projections? His smile cracked. Just a technical hiccup. IT is handling it. But the head of IT, sitting 2 seats away, spoke up quietly. We can't bypass it. The system requires architect authorization. Without it, the model is locked. If we force a reset, we risk wiping 12 years of data. The color drained from Mason's face. For the first time, the board wasn't looking at the slides or the screen or the data. They were all staring at him. And the silence, heavier than any reprimand, made every second feel like an hour. He fumbled through his deck, trying to pull up static charts, recycled graphs from last quarter, anything to fill the void. But the damage was already done. Confidence in him cracked right there in real time before the most powerful people in the company. And as the red letters glared down on him, one truth became impossible to ignore. The person he had pushed out was the only one who could make the system breathe again. The call came late in the evening, long after most of Seattle had gone quiet. My phone buzzed across the kitchen counter, lighting up with a number I recognized instantly, the company's direct line. I let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. A part of me wanted to answer right away, to hear their voices twisted with panic. But another part of me, the wiser part, knew the power of silence. On the 4th ring, I picked up. It wasn't Mason. His arrogance wouldn't allow him to dial my number. It was the CEO himself. His voice, usually measured and smooth, was raw with urgency. Adrian, we have a situation. The system, it's not responding. The board is demanding answers. We need you back at least temporarily to stabilize things. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the rain streaking down the window. For 18 years, I had given them everything. Nights, weekends, birthdays spent in the glow of server lights. And the one time they wanted to make a statement, they threw me out like I was nothing. Now they wanted me to rescue them? Let me ask you something, I said softly, letting the pause stretch just long enough to sting. Do you want a quick Band-Aid to get you through your meeting tomorrow, or do you want a permanent solution? There was silence on the other end. I could almost hear him shifting, realizing the weight of the choice. I want a permanent solution, he admitted finally. His voice carried the humility of someone who knew the ground was slipping under his feet. I didn't commit, not yet. I let him sit in that silence, let him understand what it meant to reach out to the person they had humiliated. Because this time, if I returned, it wouldn't be on their terms. And as I hung up, one thing was clear. The next conversation wouldn't just decide the system's future, it would decide mine. The next morning, I walked into Argenta's headquarters, not as an employee, but as someone holding all the leverage. The receptionist froze for a second when she saw me, almost as if a ghost had walked through the door. Word must have spread overnight. The architect was back, but not under Mason's command. They ushered me straight to the executive floor. The boardroom door opened, and there they were. The CEO, pale from lack of sleep, and Mason, arms crossed, trying to look composed, but failing. His eyes gave him away, darting, restless, afraid of what I might say. The CEO started first. Adrian, thank you for coming. We need your help. I sat down slowly, folding my hands on the table. Help doesn't come free. You made that clear when you let me go. Mason scoffed, muttering under his breath, she's just dragging this out. I turned to him, my voice calm. Dragging it out is what your slides did yesterday. What I do is build solutions. The room went still. Even he didn't have a comeback. Then I laid out my terms one by one. If I return, I answer only to the CEO, not to Mason. My title changes Chief Systems Architect with full authority over the forecasting engine. I want a written guarantee of resources, a direct line to compliance, and performance clauses in my contract that protect my work from being Barry again. The CEO nodded slowly, taking notes. Mason shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. He knew this wasn't a negotiation for him anymore. This was a transfer of power. I leaned back, letting the silence settle before finishing.
You can either patch this with a temporary fix and hope it holds, or you can rebuild Argenta's future with the person who designed its foundation. The choice is yours. The CEO exhaled heavily. We'll draft the contract today. I didn't smile. Not yet. I wanted them to feel the weight of what they were agreeing to, because this wasn't about me coming back. It was about rewriting the rules of who truly held control. And soon, the entire board would see it for themselves. When I stepped back into the boardroom, the air felt different. No longer heavy with humiliation, no longer carrying the sting of being cast aside. This time, every pair of eyes turned toward me, not with pity, but with expectation. They needed me, and they knew it. The giant screen at the far end still glowed red, access denied. Mason sat rigid in his chair, hands folded too tightly, as if he could squeeze control back into his fingers. The CEO gestured toward the system, his voice quieter than usual. "Adrian, it's yours." I set my bag on the table and pulled out my laptop. My hands moved with practiced ease, like slipping back into a language only I could speak. The room was silent, except for the sound of keys clicking steady and deliberate. I entered the authentication code, a sequence I had written years ago, hidden like a signature only the true architect would know. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, as if the system had been holding its breath, the dashboard began to light up. Numbers filled the empty grids. Charts regenerated in real time. Projections unfolded across the screen like a city skyline coming alive after a blackout. Gasps rippled through the board. The tension that had been choking the room released all at once. The machine was breathing again. I glanced up, catching Mason's expression. His face was pale, his jaw locked tight. The arrogance that once fueled his swagger was gone, replaced with something he couldn't hide: fear. He understood, maybe for the first time, that the story wasn't his to control. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The system itself had spoken louder than any words I could deliver. I closed my laptop gently and leaned back. "You wanted a permanent solution," I said evenly. "Now you have one." The CEO nodded, but the silence that followed wasn't just relief, it was anticipation. Because everyone in that room knew what came next wasn't about the system anymore. It was about accountability, and Mason's reckoning was only beginning. The room was quiet, but it wasn't the comfortable kind of silence. It was the kind that pressed on your chest, the kind that dared anyone to breathe too loudly. All eyes had shifted from the glowing dashboards back to Mason. For a long moment, he didn't speak. His jaw flexed, his hands clasped so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He tried to meet the board's gaze, but their expressions told him everything. His credibility was gone. The chairman finally broke the silence. "Mason, do you care to explain how this situation happened under your watch?" His voice cracked on the first word. It was a technical delay. He stopped when the IT director cut in firmly. "No, we logged repeated access denials. We raised it to you directly. You closed the tickets." The weight of truth landed like a hammer. Mason's excuses crumbled before he could even build them. He shifted uncomfortably, but there was nowhere to hide. I sat back, not gloating, not smirking, just watching. The reckoning wasn't mine to deliver. It was already happening, piece by piece, in every cold glance from the board and every line of failure spelled out in black and white. The CEO folded his hands, his tone heavy. "We entrusted you with oversight, Mason. Instead, you dismissed the warnings, dismissed the people who raised them, and dismissed the very foundation that kept us afloat. That cannot continue." There it was. The unspoken verdict had become words. Mason swallowed hard, but there was nothing left to argue. In that moment, the boardroom that had once been his stage had turned into his courtroom, and the sentence was written across every face in the room. The CEO's final words echoed,
Effective immediately, your tenure as CFO is over. Mason's chair scraped loudly as he stood, but no one looked at him. His exit was silent, stripped of all the arrogance he once carried through those doors. And when the door closed behind him, the room exhaled together. Relief, resolution, but also something else, expectation. Because now, with Mason gone, everyone turned back to me. The system was alive again, but the question hanging in the air was bigger than numbers. What role would I choose to play next? When Mason's footsteps faded down the hallway, the boardroom felt strangely lighter, as if a storm had finally passed. The CEO turned back to me, his expression no longer cold or distant. "Adrian," he said, "we want you to stay, not just as the one who built the system, but as the one who can guide where we go next." For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a small breath of relief. It wasn't about the title or the paycheck anymore. It was about being seen for the value I had always carried, even when others tried to erase it. I agreed to return, but on new terms, terms that ensured my work would never again dismissed or hidden behind someone else's ambition. As for Mason, he walked away without fanfare. No applause, no farewell emails, just silence. And in a way, that was the sharpest ending he could have faced. Looking back, what stays with me isn't the drama of that boardroom or the sting of being humiliated in public. It's the quiet truth I carried through it all. Real strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it endures. And when the moment comes, it doesn't need to prove anything. It simply reveals what was always there. That's the thing about loyalty and hard work. People may overlook it, take it for granted, even try to erase it. But when the foundations you built are tested, the truth comes to the surface, every time. So here's what I've learned. You don't have to fight every battle with noise. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is letting the work speak for itself. But let me ask you, what would you have done if you were in my place? Have you ever been underestimated, only to prove them wrong in the end? Share your story. You never know, it might be the reminder someone else needs to hear today.